The airport buzzed with life, a sea of travelers moving in every direction. Announcements echoed through the vast terminal, calling passengers to their gates, while the scent of coffee and jet fuel lingered in the air. Among the crowd, a young boy named Ethan clung tightly to his father's hand. His small fingers gripped his dad's palm as they made their way toward their flight. Ethan was different from the other children at the airport. At just 7 years old, he had faced more challenges than most people did in a lifetime. Diagnosed with a neurological condition that affected his motor skills, he struggled with loud noises and unfamiliar environments. Today was especially difficult. The terminal was too bright, too noisy, too overwhelming. He tugged at his father's sleeve, his face crumpling as tears welled up in his eyes. His father, Daniel Carter, crouched beside him, his voice calm and reassuring. "It's okay, buddy. Just a little longer, and we'll be on the plane. You're doing great." Daniel was no ordinary passenger. He was the CEO of the very airline they were about to board. But today, he wasn't a businessman. He was just a father trying to comfort his son. Unlike many high-profile executives, Daniel didn't flaunt his wealth or power. He believed in humility, in understanding the experiences of his passengers. That's why he often traveled incognito, dressed in casual clothes, standing in the same long lines, sitting in coach instead of first class. Today was one of those days. As they reached the boarding gate, Ethan let out a soft whimper, overwhelmed by the commotion. His body tensed, his small hands trembling. A few passengers cast curious glances, but most were too preoccupied with their own travel plans. Then, she appeared. A flight attendant in a crisp uniform, her hair pulled into a severe bun, her eyes scanning the passengers with impatience. Her name tag read, Samantha. She had been working for the airline for years, but somewhere along the way, she had lost the warmth and compassion that the job required. To her, passengers were merely numbers, problems to be solved as quickly as possible. When her gaze landed on Ethan, her expression darkened. The boy's quiet whimpers grew into soft sobs, his small frame trembling as he clung to his father. Samantha's lips pursed in irritation. She had dealt with fussy children before, but something about this situation made her temper flare. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was frustration. Whatever the reason, she stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Sir, you need to control your child," she snapped, folding her arms. "Other passengers are trying to board." Daniel looked up, his brows furrowing. "He's just a little overwhelmed. We'll be fine in a minute." Samantha let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling her eyes. "If he's going to cry the entire flight, maybe you should consider taking a different one." Ethan flinched at the harsh tone, his grip on his father tightening. Daniel's jaw tensed, but he remained calm. "We have tickets for this flight. We're not going anywhere else." Samantha wasn't satisfied with that answer. Without warning, she reached forward and pushed Ethan back, not hard, but enough to make him stumble. The action was swift, thoughtless, fueled by frustration rather than malice. But to Ethan, it was terrifying. To Daniel, it was unacceptable. A stunned silence fell over the surrounding passengers. Ethan let out a cry, his face turning red with fear. Daniel's hands clenched into fists, his eyes narrowing as he rose to his full height. Samantha crossed her arms. "I don't have time for this," she muttered, turning away as if the situation were resolved. Daniel took a slow breath, steadying himself. He had spent years handling difficult negotiations, navigating crises, making decisions that affected thousands of employees. But nothing had ever made his blood boil like this moment. He looked down at his son, then back at Samantha. She had no idea who he was, and she was about to find out. Daniel's fingers curled into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, some watching with curiosity, others with discomfort. His son was still trembling, his small body pressed close against his side. Ethan wasn't just upset, he was scared. And that was what infuriated Daniel the most. He crouched down beside his son, gently rubbing his back. "It's okay, buddy. I'm right here." His voice was soothing, but inside, a storm was brewing. He had spent years building this airline from the ground up, ensuring that every passenger was treated with respect and dignity. And now, one of his own employees had done the exact opposite. Samantha didn't seem to notice or care. She had already turned back toward the line of passengers, waving them forward like nothing had happened. To her, it was just another inconvenience, another problem solved. She had no idea she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Daniel took a deep breath and stood up. He could have revealed himself right then and there. He could have told her who he was, watched the color drain from her face as she realized what she had done. But something stopped him. He wanted to see how far this would go. Would she continue treating them this way? Would anyone else step in? He had always believed that true character was revealed in moments like this, not when people were being watched, but when they thought no one important was paying attention. As the line moved forward, Daniel lifted Ethan into his arms. His son's small hands clutched at his shirt, his breaths coming in uneven gasps. "Daddy." Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. "I know, buddy," Daniel said softly. "We're almost there." When they reached the front of the line, Samantha barely spared them a glance. "Boarding passes." Daniel handed them over, watching her face carefully. She scanned them quickly, her expression blank. Then she gave Ethan a pointed look. "If he has another meltdown on board, you'll need to keep him quiet. We can't have disruptions during the flight." Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay composed. "I think you've done enough," he said evenly. Samantha raised an eyebrow, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" A second flight attendant, a younger man with a kind face, had stepped forward. His name tag read David, and unlike Samantha, his expression was filled with concern. Daniel could tell he hadn't seen what had happened earlier. He had just sensed the tension and come to check. Samantha shook her head dismissively. "No problem. Just making sure all passengers are following procedures." David didn't look convinced. His eyes flickered to Ethan, who had buried his face in his father's shoulder. "Sir, is everything okay?" Daniel hesitated. He wasn't sure if he wanted to cause a scene, at least not yet. But before he could answer, a woman standing behind them in line spoke up. "I saw what happened," she said. Her voice was firm, her eyes sharp. "That flight attendant shoved his son." A murmur rippled through the passengers nearby. Some had seen it, others had only caught parts of it, but now people were paying attention. David's expression shifted immediately. He turned to Samantha, his brows furrowing. "Is that true?" Samantha scoffed, shaking her head. "Oh, come on. He was having a tantrum. I barely touched him." Daniel felt a rush of anger, but he kept his tone measured. "My son has a neurological condition." He was overwhelmed, and instead of showing patience, you chose to escalate the situation. Samantha rolled her eyes. "Look, I don't have time for this. If you have a complaint, take it up with customer service." David's frown deepened. He glanced at Daniel again, as if sensing there was more to the story. Then he made a decision. "Sir, I apologize for what happened. If you'd like to take a moment before boarding, I can escort you to a quieter area." Daniel appreciated the gesture, but he had no intention of stepping aside. He wanted to see how much worse this could get. "We're fine," he said. "But I do expect this to be addressed." David nodded, but Samantha simply turned away, muttering something under her breath as she signaled for the next passengers to step forward. Daniel carried Ethan down the jet bridge, his mind racing. This wasn't over. As they stepped onto the plane, another flight attendant greeted them with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard. Seats are right this way." Daniel nodded in appreciation and made his way to their seats. He settled Ethan into the window seat, buckling him in with care. His son's breathing had steadied, but his eyes were still wide, his body tense. Daniel leaned in, his voice gentle. "We're safe now, okay?" Ethan nodded slowly, but he didn't say anything. Daniel sat back, his mind already formulating his next steps. He had spent years ensuring that his airline upheld the highest standards of service. The behavior he had witnessed today was unacceptable, and it needed to be dealt with. But he wasn't going to storm into the cockpit or make a scene mid-flight. That wasn't his style. No, he was going to handle this the right way. He pulled out his phone, typing out a quick message. "Find out everything you can about a flight attendant named Samantha. I want a full report by the time we land." He sent it to his assistant, knowing that by the time they touched down, he would have everything he needed. As the plane began to taxi, Daniel stole a glance toward the front of the cabin. Samantha was moving through the aisles, still acting as if nothing had happened. She had no idea what was coming. As the plane ascended into the sky, Daniel kept his eyes forward, his thoughts racing. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but inside his mind there was only silence, a calm before the inevitable storm. He had built his airline with integrity, ensuring that every employee upheld a standard of care and respect. What had happened today was a direct violation of everything he stood for. And yet, the person responsible carried on as if nothing had happened. Ethan leaned his head against the window, his fingers tracing patterns on the glass. His breathing had steadied, but Daniel could still see the tension in his small shoulders. He had seen his son struggle before. Ethan's condition made it hard for him to adapt to new environments, but this was different. This wasn't just discomfort. This was fear. Daniel clenched his jaw. He would never let his son feel unsafe. Not here. Not anywhere. A few rows ahead, Samantha moved through the aisle, her voice carrying over the gentle hum of the plane. "Trash? Any trash?" she asked, her tone impatient as she moved past the passengers. She didn't even glance in Daniel's direction as she passed. But others did. A middle-aged woman across the aisle gave him a sympathetic look. A man a few rows back whispered something to his wife. People had noticed. They had seen what had happened. And yet, Samantha remained oblivious, or perhaps she simply didn't care. Daniel glanced down at his phone. A new message appeared from his assistant. Samantha Green. Been with the airline for 8 years. History of complaints. Some minor, some serious. No official disciplinary action taken. Should I dig deeper? Daniel exhaled slowly. Yes. I want everything. He slid his phone into his pocket and looked back at Ethan, who had finally started to relax. His son's eyes fluttered shut, exhaustion taking over. Daniel gently pulled a blanket over him, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. He had always believed in handling things the right way. He didn't believe in making a scene or using his power recklessly. But today was different. Today his son had been hurt, not physically, but in a way that would stick with him. And the woman responsible for it had no idea what she had just done. David, the kind flight attendant from earlier, passed by, pausing when he saw Ethan asleep. "He doing okay?" he asked quietly. Daniel nodded. "Yeah. Thanks for checking." David hesitated. "Look, I didn't see what happened back there, but I heard some of the passengers talking. If there was an issue with Samantha, I just want you to know. I'll make sure it's reported." Daniel studied him for a moment. There was no way David knew who he was. He was just doing what was right. "I appreciate that," Daniel said. David gave a small nod before moving on. It was a simple interaction, but it told Daniel everything he needed to know. Some people still cared. Some people still did the right thing, even when no one was watching. Samantha, however, was not one of those people. As the flight continued, Daniel remained quiet, observing. Samantha interacted with the passengers, but there was something cold about the way she moved, the way she spoke. She was efficient, yes, but there was no kindness, no warmth. She went through the motions, but it was clear she saw the passengers as an inconvenience rather than her responsibility. Then, something else happened. A few rows ahead, a young mother was struggling to calm her toddler. The little girl squirmed in her seat, her tiny hands reaching for the armrest as she let out small, frustrated cries. The mother looked exhausted, her eyes filled with silent apologies to the passengers around her. Samantha approached, her expression already hardened. "Ma'am, you need to keep your child under control," she said, her voice clipped. The mother looked up, startled. "I'm trying. She's just restless." Samantha sighed, cutting her off. "If she doesn't settle down, we'll have to inform the captain." Daniel's eyes narrowed. It was the same tone she had used with him. The same lack of patience. The same complete disregard for the fact that she was dealing with real people, not just seats to be managed. The mother swallowed, nodding quickly as she rocked her daughter gently. Samantha didn't say another word. She just turned and walked away. Daniel leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. The pattern was clear now. This wasn't a one-time incident. This was who she was. As the flight continued, Daniel found himself thinking back to the early days of the airline. When he had first started, he had made it a priority to hire employees who truly cared about people. He had spent years ensuring that his airline wasn't just another corporate machine, but something built on respect and trust. And yet, here he was, sitting in one of his own planes, watching one of his own employees fail at the most fundamental part of her job. Ethan stood beside him, shifting in his sleep. Daniel gently smoothed his hair back, his decision already made. Samantha thought she had gotten away with what she did. She had no idea her actions were about to catch up with her. The hum of the aircraft filled the cabin, but Daniel barely heard it. His mind was set on one thing: watching, waiting. He had spent years making sure his airline upheld the highest standards, but today, sitting in coach with his son asleep beside him, he realized something disturbing. Somewhere along the way, people like Samantha had slipped through the cracks. He checked his phone. Another message from his assistant. More complaints found. Passengers describing her as rude, dismissive. A few reports of unnecessary aggression, but nothing ever escalated enough for official action. Seems like she's been careful. Daniel's grip tightened around the device. He knew how this worked. Some employees learned to walk a fine line, staying just within the limits of what could be overlooked. Samantha had likely perfected the art of mistreating passengers without outright violating policies in a way that would force disciplinary action. But today, she had gone too far. Ethan stirred beside him, his small hand curling into the fabric of his father's shirt. Even in sleep, he sought comfort. Daniel gently patted his back, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about his son. It wasn't just about him. It was about every passenger Samantha had treated this way. A few rows ahead, she moved through the cabin, her posture rigid. She checked seatbelts, adjusted overhead bins, and gave passengers the same cold, detached look she always did. She hadn't changed her demeanor, not even after what had happened at the gate. If anything, she seemed even more irritated, as if she thought she had been inconvenienced by the entire situation. Then, something unexpected happened. An older gentleman sitting in the aisle seat of the exit row struggled with his overhead bag. His fingers fumbled as he tried to adjust it, his movements slow. He looked to be in his late 70s, his frame thin, his hands shaking slightly with age. Samantha stopped in front of him, tapping her foot impatiently. "Sir, if you can't handle the responsibility of sitting in the exit row, I'm going to have to move you." The man's face fell. I'm fine. I just need a moment to adjust my bag." She sighed loudly, glancing toward the back of the plane as if she had better things to do. "We need to be prepared for emergencies." If you can't react quickly, I'll have to reseat you. Passengers nearby exchanged uneasy glances. The tension thickened. Daniel leaned forward slightly, watching closely. The old man finally managed to secure his bag, his hands still unsteady. "There, it's done," he said quietly. But Samantha wasn't finished. "Just be aware that if there's an emergency, we expect you to assist. If you're not confident in that, I can move you now." The man looked down, his face filled with embarrassment. Daniel had seen enough. He stood up. The movement was subtle, but it caught Samantha's attention. She turned, her expression hardening when she saw him. "Sir, please remain seated while the seatbelt sign is on." Daniel didn't say anything at first. He simply held her gaze. There was a shift in the air, a quiet power in the way he looked at her. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Passengers nearby were watching now. The cabin had gone silent. Then Daniel spoke, his voice calm, steady, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "You seem to have a habit of treating passengers like problems instead of people." A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. "Excuse me?" Daniel took a slow step forward. "First my son. Now this gentleman. How many others?" Samantha's lips pressed into a thin line. "Sir, I don't know what you're implying, but I am simply following protocol." A quiet chuckle escaped Daniel. It wasn't amusement, it was disbelief. "Is that what you call it?" Samantha crossed her arms. "If you have a problem with me, you're welcome to file a complaint after we land." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Oh, don't worry. I will." The way he said it made something shift in the air again. It wasn't a threat, it was a certainty. Passengers whispered among themselves. The atmosphere had changed, the moment growing heavier. Even David, the younger flight attendant, stood near the back of the plane, watching the exchange with a concerned expression. Samantha seemed to sense that something was off, but she still didn't understand. Daniel took out his phone, tapped a few buttons, and then looked back at her. "You might want to check with the captain," he said casually. "I think he'll be interested to know who's on board today." Samantha frowned, her confidence faltering. "What are you talking about?" Daniel slid his phone back into his pocket and gave her a small, knowing smile. "Let's just say, I don't think you'll like the answer." For the first time, Samantha looked uneasy. She glanced toward the front of the cabin as if considering her next move. The plane continued soaring through the sky, but inside, the tension had reached its peak. Samantha had no idea what was coming next, but she was about to find out. Samantha's expression flickered with uncertainty, but she quickly masked it with a forced look of authority. She wasn't used to being questioned, especially not like this, not by a passenger who spoke with such quiet certainty. But something in Daniel's voice made her uneasy. He wasn't just another frustrated traveler. He was different. She straightened her posture and narrowed her eyes. "Sir, if you continue to disrupt the flight, I'll have to involve the captain." Daniel let out a slow breath, his lips curling into a faint, unreadable smile. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." For the first time, Samantha hesitated. The murmur among the passengers was growing, eyes darting between her and Daniel. She wasn't in control of the situation anymore, and she knew it. Then, a chime sounded over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The calm, authoritative voice echoed through the cabin. But to Samantha, it felt like a warning bell. "We've been informed of an internal matter on board and will be addressing it shortly. In the meantime, we ask that all passengers remain seated and allow the crew to perform their duties." Samantha stiffened. Internal matter? That could only mean one thing. Someone had reported her. Her eyes darted to Daniel, who remained standing, perfectly composed. He met her gaze with a look that sent a chill down her spine. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Who exactly do you think you are?" Daniel exhaled, shaking his head slightly. He hadn't planned on revealing himself just yet, but Samantha's arrogance left him no choice. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a sleek black card, and held it up just enough for her to see the embossed lettering. Her eyes widened as she read the words, Daniel Carter, CEO, SkyWest Airlines. The color drained from her face. For the first time, real fear flickered in her expression. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She looked around the cabin, realizing that the very passengers she had dismissed and mistreated had just witnessed everything. Daniel tucked the card away, his expression calm but firm. "I gave you plenty of chances," he said quietly. "I watched. I waited. And you proved exactly what kind of person you are." Samantha swallowed hard. I didn't know." "That doesn't matter," Daniel cut in. "Because it shouldn't take knowing who I am for you to treat people with respect." A deep, suffocating silence filled the cabin. The passengers who had once been whispering now sat in stunned stillness, watching the moment unfold. Then, another voice broke the silence. "Excuse me." David, the younger flight attendant, stepped forward, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, something Daniel recognized. It wasn't just concern. It was resolve. "I need to report something," David said, looking directly at Samantha. "Something I've been afraid to speak up about for a long time." Samantha's head snapped toward him. "What?" she said sharply. David swallowed, then straightened his posture. "This isn't the first time. I've seen you mistreat passengers before. I've seen you humiliate people. And I regret not saying something sooner." The murmur in the cabin turned into hushed gasps. The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the passengers. Samantha's face turned pale. You don't know what you're talking about." "I do," David said firmly. "And I'm done staying quiet." Daniel watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. This was the moment Samantha realized she wasn't just dealing with an angry passenger. She was dealing with the consequences of every decision she had made. The intercom chimed again. "Mr. Carter," the captain's voice came through, steady and professional. "Would you like to handle this matter yourself, or should I intervene?" The entire plane went silent. Every passenger held their breath. Samantha's hands shook slightly. "Please. I didn't mean." But Daniel simply exhaled, his decision already made. "This flight will continue as scheduled," he said, his voice even. "But Samantha? This is your last one." The finality of his words sent a chill through the air. And just like that, the power had shifted. The weight of Daniel's words hung heavy in the air. Samantha's face turned pale, her once confident posture now rigid with fear. She opened her mouth as if to argue, to plead, but no words came out. Around her, the cabin was silent, passengers staring with a mixture of shock and satisfaction. David took a small step back, his hands clenched at his sides. He had done something that had terrified him for months, spoken up. And now, watching Samantha stand there, powerless, he knew it had been the right thing. The intercom clicked again, the captain's voice breaking the tension. "Understood, Mr. Carter. We will proceed accordingly. Cabin crew, stand by." Samantha flinched at the sound of his voice. She knew what was happening. There was no coming back from this. Daniel remained calm, his expression unreadable. "You have two choices," he said evenly. "You can finish this flight quietly, professionally, and with whatever dignity you have left. Or I can have you escorted off when we land, with security waiting. Either way, your employment with this airline is over." Samantha swallowed hard, her face twisting in frustration, in panic. She had spent years walking the fine line, pushing limits without consequences. But now, she had gone too far. She glanced at David, then at the older gentleman she had humiliated. The passengers were still watching, their eyes filled with quiet judgment. Finally, she exhaled sharply, nodding stiffly. "I'll do my job," she muttered. Daniel gave a slow nod. "Good choice." Samantha turned quickly, walking toward the front of the plane, her shoulders tense. But there was no more power in her steps. No authority. She was simply waiting for the inevitable. David let out a quiet breath of relief, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He met Daniel's gaze, and for the first time, there was something close to gratitude in his eyes. The plane carried on in silence for a few minutes. The tension still lingered, but something had shifted. The air felt lighter, as if justice had settled over the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding slightly toward Daniel in silent approval. Ethan stood beside him, blinking his eyes open. "Dad?" he murmured sleepily. Daniel turned to him immediately, his expression softening. "Hey, buddy. You okay?" Ethan rubbed his eyes and nodded. "Yeah." "Did we land?" Daniel smiled. "Not yet. Just a little more to go." Ethan yawned and settled back into his seat, unaware of everything that had just happened. And maybe that was for the best. Daniel leaned back, exhaling slowly. The situation had been handled. Samantha's reign of arrogance was over. But just as he thought the ordeal was behind him, a voice spoke up from the row behind him. "Mr. Carter?" Daniel turned. It was the older gentleman from the exit row, the one Samantha had humiliated earlier. "I just wanted to say, thank you," the man said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Most people would have let her get away with it. You didn't." Daniel gave him a respectful nod. "No one deserves to be treated like that." The man smiled slightly. "I used to work in aviation," he said. "Long before your time, I'm sure. But I always believed that airlines were built on trust. Seeing someone like you still standing up for that, it gives me hope." Daniel's chest tightened slightly. He hadn't expected that. The man hesitated, then added, "And just so you know, you made the right call. People like her, they don't change unless someone forces them to." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the words. He had spent years running this airline, making decisions from boardrooms and executive offices. But today, sitting here among the passengers, he had seen something he couldn't ignore. He had always believed in doing the right thing. And today he had. The plane continued its steady flight, cutting through the clouds. Samantha, now silent at the front of the cabin, had finally met her reckoning. David stood taller, more confident, and Daniel sat with his son beside him, knowing that this flight, this moment, had changed everything. But just as the tension seemed to fade, the intercom chimed one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came through. "We've just received word from ground control. Upon landing, all passengers are required to remain seated for a security matter that will be addressed before deplaning." A ripple of confusion spread through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. Daniel frowned, his instincts kicking in. Security matter? What else could possibly be happening now? Then, he noticed something. Samantha was no longer at the front of the plane. His pulse quickened. Where had she gone? And why did he have the sudden feeling that this flight wasn't over just yet? The low hum of the engines filled the tense silence in the cabin. Passengers exchanged confused glances, whispers rippling through the rows. A security matter? Daniel's instincts told him something wasn't right. His eyes scanned the front of the plane, but Samantha was nowhere to be seen. David, still standing near the galley, seemed to realize it too. His brow furrowed as he looked toward the back of the aircraft, as if expecting her to reappear at any moment. But she didn't. Daniel leaned slightly into the aisle, scanning for any sign of movement. Then he saw it. A flicker of motion near the emergency exit. His stomach tightened. Samantha stood near the rear door, her posture rigid. The way she held herself, the way she glanced over her shoulder, it wasn't right. She wasn't just waiting for landing. She was planning something. Daniel quickly unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, ignoring the seatbelt sign still glowing overhead. David noticed immediately and moved toward him. "What's going on?" David asked in a hushed voice. Daniel nodded toward the back of the plane. "Where's Samantha?" David's eyes followed his, then widened slightly when he saw her. "What is she?" He stopped, realization setting in. Daniel didn't wait. He started moving down the aisle, keeping his steps controlled but swift. Passengers watched as he passed, sensing the unspoken urgency in the air. As he approached, Samantha turned abruptly. Her expression flickered between panic and anger. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice tight, "you're not supposed to be out of your seat." Daniel didn't slow down. "Neither are you." She stiffened, her fingers twitching near the door handle. David appeared behind him, his voice careful but firm. "Samantha, what are you doing?" Her jaw clenched. "Nothing. Just preparing for landing like I always do." Daniel took another step forward. "Then why do you look like you're about to walk off this plane before we even touch the ground?" Her eyes darted between him and the door, calculating. She had lost her job, lost her authority, and now reality was closing in on her. "I just needed a moment," she muttered. "Away from everyone." Daniel wasn't buying it. "Sit down, Samantha." For a moment, it looked like she was going to argue. But then, a sharp voice crackled over the intercom. "Ms. Reynolds, this is the captain. Return to your station immediately." Samantha flinched at the use of her full name. The captain wasn't asking. He was ordering. Slowly, her hands dropped from where they had hovered near the exit handle. She stepped back, her expression a mix of defeat and frustration. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the front of the plane, slipping into one of the empty jump seats near the galley. David let out a quiet breath beside Daniel. "That was close." Daniel nodded but said nothing. He didn't know what Samantha had been planning, but it didn't matter now. This flight would land, and she would be escorted off, just as promised. Minutes later, the plane descended smoothly, the runway lights glowing below. The landing gear engaged, and with a gentle touch, the wheels met the ground. A sense of relief washed over the cabin as the aircraft slowed to a taxi. But the tension wasn't over yet. The moment they reached the gate, two uniformed officers stepped onto the plane, their presence commanding silence. They moved with purpose, heading straight toward Samantha. Passengers watched, holding their breath, as one of the officers leaned down and spoke quietly to her. She didn't resist. She just nodded stiffly, her face blank, and stood up. Without a word, she was led off the plane. A few passengers clapped softly, just a few, not in celebration, but in quiet acknowledgement. Justice had been served. David exhaled, shaking his head. "I never thought I'd see the day." Daniel watched as Samantha disappeared through the jet bridge. Sometimes, it just takes the right moment. Passengers began gathering their belongings, murmuring among themselves. The tension that had filled the flight slowly faded, replaced by a sense of closure. As Daniel reached for his bag, he felt a tug at his sleeve. Ethan looked up at him, still sleepy but curious. "Dad, what happened?" Daniel smiled softly and ruffled his son's hair. "Just made sure everything was fair, buddy." Ethan nodded as if that was enough of an explanation. And maybe, in the simplest way, it was. As they exited the plane, Daniel took one last look back. The cabin was clearing out, the crew going about their usual routine. It was just another flight. But today, something had changed. Daniel had spent years building this airline, ensuring it was known for excellence and fairness. But today, he had been reminded that no policy, no rule, could replace the responsibility of simply standing up for what was right. He stepped onto the jet bridge, Ethan's small hand in his, and let the moment settle. Justice had been served. The flight had landed. And tomorrow, the skies would be just a little better because of it.